A few days ago, Patreon decided to cancel my account without warning, without explanation as to any specific violation of their policies, other than that I'd apparently offended a, quote, protected group. Of course, I have no right to be surprised by this. There's scarcely a large corporate institution left, least of all in the world of tech, that hasn't pledged its full support to the ideological doctrine of the current ruling class, and thus the ideological far left. But even if we've all come to expect this type of behavior from this new culture that has managed to essentially hijack and monopolize what was once a beautiful and truly free internet, brimming with potential, I don't think their actions should go unmentioned. And I wanted to say a few words, not just in my own defense, but also in the defense of those scores of others who've been targeted in similar ways, and the scores more who, understandably, no longer even attempt to use the majority of internet platforms, knowing full well the caliber and the intent of the individuals who now control them. Never forget what the internet once was, and the promise of what it could have been, and could be in the future, relative to what it's become today. Because this contrast says everything about our downward cultural trajectory, and provides a perfect example of how a cultural subset centered around money and finance seem to corrupt and subvert everything they touch. A brief message to Patreon and those like them, should any of you ever watch this. What you're doing is disgusting, cowardly, objectively unjust, and can only lead to violence and bloodshed in the future. This game plan of institutional capture and this attempted monopolization of all organs of power and influence is essentially an act of war. I know many of you administrative class underlings don't see it this way because you sit in comfortable chairs in a comfortable office, surrounding yourself with enough empty buzzwords and virtue signals to foster the delusion of moral high ground, and perhaps even believe the elaborate justifications you and yours have drawn up as to why you have to silence the roughly half or more of the population that fundamentally disagrees with you. But when you eliminate a person's ability to be heard, when you destroy their livelihood and ability to earn, to feed, clothe, and house themselves, you cross a dangerous red line that there's essentially no coming back from. You're effectively presenting the rest of us with an ultimatum. Join in the destruction of your culture, your way of life, and your most deeply held beliefs, and assist in, or at least agree to passively ignore, this creation of a new, degenerate culture that so openly despises you, or be destroyed. It's no coincidence that the massive spike in depression, in fentanyl usage and deaths, in suicide and hopelessness has perfectly coincided with this hostile takeover. And a portion of this blood is very much on your hands. You've managed to separate the population into two camps: the naive, oblivious, and willing to play ball, to go along to get along, and do whatever it takes to climb the ladders in front of them, and those who can't help but see where this is all headed, and feel a profound righteous indignation and anger toward this injustice. Truth fears nothing. It's cowards and deceivers that seek to silence their opposition, tyrants and parasites that fear the light of day, because they intuitively know their ideas and goals can only succeed in the most artificial and tightly controlled environments. Environments in which the voices of bought men and collaborators are magnified and heavily financially incentivized, and opposing voices are silenced, destroyed, and made destitute by any means necessary. If and when this factional Cold War someday goes hot, remember that it was you that fired the first shots. Across the ideological divide, we've always had disagreements of opinion, the one thing that kept us from going at one another's throats was keeping the so-called marketplace of ideas open to both sides. This is an absolute necessity to keep the peace. When you shut and bar the door, you've declared war. Not in a bold, courageous, and forthright way, but in that passive-aggressive and scheming manner that, sad to say, seems so natural and innate to your side. Look around you for a moment. Your allies are BlackRock and Vanguard, Soros and Rothschild, corrupt businessmen and criminals and pedophiles, virtually the entire political class and corporate press. If this doesn't give you pause, you're not a thinking human being. Or you simply don't care. Either way, know there are consequences for your actions. They're not always swift, and justice often moves slowly and manifests in unconventional ways. But your 15 minutes won't last forever, and the "just following orders" line never holds up well, and weakness is no excuse. You will eventually pay a price for these very real crimes. Enjoy those pieces of silver while you still can. And that's about all I have to say to that element of the population. To my Patreons, though. It's a shame I wasn't allowed to say a proper goodbye or give one final thanks for the support. For those that have been around nearly from the start, you might remember that I was in the most dire of straits before finding just enough support truly at the last moment to avoid being thrust into some extremely difficult and uncertain territory. It's what allowed me to focus on the Subverted History series and similar creative projects, the most significant of which have yet to be published, and what helped me overcome that sickly feeling of not knowing how I'd manage bills in the coming month. So if you're listening, a very sincere thank you. I'm grateful to you each not only as individuals, but in a broader, higher sense of that word. When things are at their lowest and suddenly a new door opens, and especially when it's kindness and generosity that saves the day, it's a beautiful thing to experience, and it only further stokes that desire to give something back in whatever way I'm able. It seems that specific door has slammed shut again, but I only have myself to blame for that. I didn't know it'd be quite so soon, but I knew this was likely coming at some point, because I'm fully aware of the types of people that currently run companies like Patreon. And there do exist some great alternatives, which seem to be run by principled individuals and apparently take less of a cut. So, part of the reason for this video is a shameless request for help, as uncomfortable as it makes me. For those that still wish to support me and my work, I've included a link to one of these alternatives called Subscribestar, owned and operated by people I've talked to in the past who seem to have a genuine interest in free and open discussion and a track record to prove it. The site may not be as pretty or as sophisticated or feature-rich, but this seems a small price to pay to be forever free from the grasp of hostile corporate constructs that can pull the plug on a whim. Unfortunately, Patreon was the vast majority of my income stream, and what essentially kept me afloat. What's sick is that I think they know this is the case in many of these instances. And based on all I've seen and heard, I suspect many of them actually relish the idea of pulling that plug, suddenly and jarringly. It really is sick. So to those willing to make that jump from Patreon to Subscribestar, thank you. And of course, the same for all non-Patreons as well. I've also included some crypto addresses and my usual P.O. Box address for anyone that might wish to help via other avenues. I mentioned how uncomfortable this makes me. It's not merely because of the extreme allergy I've developed to the world of money. It's also because witnessing some of the generosity I've received and knowing full well that it sometimes comes from people in difficult financial positions themselves, is beyond humbling, even a bit brutal and bittersweet. I set out down this creative path in large part because of you, because I saw so many good people facing more and more obstacles, suffering and struggling and having a hard go of things, in an increasingly unjust environment, seemingly designed to produce exactly this result. And one of my goals is to eventually find meaningful ways to help here, not take. So my caveat to the request for assistance, and I mean this, is please don't give if you're in an especially difficult position yourself. Thank you with the utmost sincerity for the thought and inclination, but please know you're doing me a bigger favor by keeping it and improving your own lot. Lastly, for the couple of people that have sent significant donations in the past, including anonymously via crypto, I can't thank you enough. You've helped more than you know. And it's this type of anonymous generosity that humbles and drives me, and helps me into that enviable and healthy and powerful psychological state of gratitude. That said, please do feel free to email me to identify yourself at some point. It'd be nice to extend appreciation personally. Anyhow, now that this is out of the way, while I have your ear, I can't help but speak to a few other topics and our broader situation. I spoke of institutional capture, and I think this is a helpful frame and a term we should be using much more often, as it seems to speak to the heart of all that plagues us at the moment. Nobody dares make the argument that those currently in power and in positions of influence are an accurate representation of the public at large. Whether it be the media, the corporate world, entertainment and popular culture, or the political sphere, at this stage, a person would have to be blind to not recognize that only those willing to give voice to certain viewpoints are allowed entry into and promotion within these worlds. And this is precisely why it's all destined to fall apart. A people being ruled and governed by a small subset that in no way, shape, or form represents their interests is a people ripe for revolution, or brutally imposed tyranny. I sincerely believe we're headed towards the former, one way or another. Regardless, there's a good chance that the coming years will be even more trying and draining than the previous, exhausting and demoralizing to the highest degree if we're not careful. Leaders and power brokers will be ever more incompetent and corrupt and brazen, ever more petty and spiteful. What we're experiencing is a wholesale degeneration on all fronts, and the reason it even still needs to get worse before it gets better is due to that lukewarm element of the population deluded into thinking this all might somehow just magically blow over or resolve itself. This element may need to see and experience some truly terrible things before they're finally shaken from that unique type of stupor produced by the increasingly potent bread and circuses of our entertainment-obsessed technological age. And things truly are degenerating now at an almost unbelievable pace across the board. Architecture has been made depressing, modern music soulless, modern art uninspiring, porn and junk food cheap and plentiful. Nearly all news is negative, nearly all advertisements aggressively deceitful. Jesus overturning tables of the money changers in the temple was a microcosm of the larger fight. In a sense, ideally, our world is meant to be an extension of the house of God, His creation ticking forward in accordance with His will. Yet it's being turned into a cheap marketplace. As our nations and structures collapse, I strongly believe the goal needs to be a focus on maximizing physical, mental, and spiritual health in the face of it all, and a recognition that these three types of health are heavily correlated and interconnected. In my opinion, the ideal is a lightness of spirit, yet coupled with a depth and breadth of spirit. In other words, a lightheartedness that isn't superficial or empty. Despite coming to disagree and part ways with Friedrich Nietzsche on several fronts, I've forever treasured some of his most powerful lines. And one of my favorites that springs to mind here is, quote, "A man's maturity consists in having found again the seriousness one had as a child at play," end quote. We don't get to choose all that happens to us throughout life, but we do have ultimate control over how we choose to process and integrate these happenings. The most healthy and robust peoples, historically speaking, found ways to steel themselves to hardship and suffering without becoming numb or losing their spirit of playfulness or adventure. This is the path, developing approaches to the world that sidestep heavy anchors and weights and dark clouds, and the recognition that so much of this is delusion. Nearly everything we dread isn't nearly as bad as we feared it might be when all is said and done. Those that live in states of stressful and anxious neuroticism create their own hells in these regards. I'm fully aware that all of this is easier said than done, especially in this environment and at such a point in history. But, of course, it's also far more important now than ever. As much as you're able, seek to draw closer to all that strengthens, improves, and elevates and better orients you, and aim to sidestep all else wherever possible. Focus on what ails us only until you feel you understand it sufficiently to help counter it or craft solutions, and not a single moment more. And to help combat this feeling of being overwhelmed, keep in mind that we're not exclusively responsible for the state of the world. Our foremost responsibility is to our own personal sphere, ourselves, our family and friends, our tribes. Do what you can, when you can, with whatever you've been given, and this is truly all that can be asked of you. You've likely heard the expression that, quote, "A harmless man is not a good man. A good man is a very, very dangerous man who has it under voluntary control," end quote. With regard to powerful archetypal emotions, anger, for example, I'm always drawn back to the chariot analogy here. Either these are wild and untamed forces, chaotically darting heedlessly on their own course, or we've found a way to harness them, to help pull us more efficiently in a direction of our choosing, under our command. Unchanneled or poorly oriented forces of anger or hatred can be immensely self-destructive. Also, I think it incredibly helpful to be careful of the words we use, insofar as possible to give them some real thought and recognize their power and their shaping effect. It's so easy to spread exhaustion or nihilism or hopelessness if we're not cognizant of our communications. Even Tucker Carlson, to use an example, falls into this trap from time to time by saying things like, quote, "And of course they'll never face punishment," or, quote, "In a few years we'll all be," and then he goes on to speak to some dystopian hellscape. It may seem like some minor inconsequential thing, but I promise you it's not. Our words create our reality, of course. This doesn't mean that we can simply say everything is fine over and over as the world burns to the ground around us. And this is where so much of the modern and flighty self-help nonsense falls short, because the caveat here is that to have the purchase power and shaping force behind them, these words must also be truthful, must intuitively ring true in the ears of the listener. A statement like, "These people will never face justice," does ring true to some degree to so many listening on, because we've had such a long period of the most extreme injustice and corruption. But when one broadcasts this definitive "will never," especially anyone with a significant platform, it actually helps make this a reality. Our minds can't help but process it, integrate it, and prepare for and expect the worst accordingly. One enters a mental state of passive despondency and perceived powerlessness to the extent that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Of course, this doesn't mean that the words of any one person have the power to completely and immediately alter one's perspectives. But the cumulative force of many people saying similar things does have the power to lead us down such paths. And words and thoughts and ideas, like everything else, are very much contagious. For what it's worth, I'd like to see us all make a conscious effort to avoid such definitive negative proclamations anytime there's a chance they might not come to pass. To use this example of the highest level criminals never facing prosecution, do we really think that this will be the case forever? That nothing could or would ever occur in the broad stretch of time to change this dynamic? How many times in human history have similar sentiments been held by the public, only to have a cultural or political seismic shift suddenly occur to completely change the state of things? To summarize this thought, we certainly shouldn't be delusionally optimistic or idealistic to the extent that we don't see or that we misjudge the real obstacles in front of us. But I feel we should be equally careful not to lock ourselves in to this mindset that nothing ever changes and nothing can be helped, else nothing will ever change and nothing will be helped. The goal is artfully finding the most positive, truthful perspective, without compromising this truthfulness in any way in the process. A critical mass of people thinking and speaking in such a way has the power to significantly change things over time, powerfully and efficiently. The theme of the next few years will likely be weathering the storm, while finding ways to help lay the foundation of what will eventually rise out of the ashes, and perhaps launching ourselves into this storm when the time is right, because another dominant theme will be a raging factional battle between parasitic elements and their botmen and mercenary armies in all spheres, and those who refuse to be cowed and seek a more healthy and just mode of living in accordance with natural and higher law. And I'm looking forward to speaking quite a bit more to these topics in the near future. Never forget that insofar as we're on God's side, God is on our side, fighting against parasitism and child predation, against the attempted destruction of biological realities like gender, and the mangling of bodies to create some abominable middle ground, the brazen rewriting of human history to stoke racial hatred and produce the most unjust playing field. All of this is evil and a temporary aberration to be soon swept away. Nature is self-healing because the perfect creative force behind it all designed it to be. This certainly doesn't mean bad things never happen or darkness never triumphs temporarily, but that in the long term, fighting against nature is always a losing battle. Ultimately, we win this. It's just a case of when and how much more of a cost we'll need to pay in collective suffering and hardship, and perhaps bloodshed on the way there. Keep your head up and avoid being gaslit into believing your beliefs represent some fringe minority. This is the core purpose of institutional capture and modern algorithms, to present a completely false picture of reality, to allow approximately 1% to pretend they're practically a majority, and that their ideas and goals represent norms and median viewpoints, to offer up the notion that they're all powerful, have mass support, and that the situation for any who oppose them really is hopeless. Just as fire is the test of gold, adversity is the test of strong men. We'll come out the other side, with so much dross and detritus burned away and left behind. Or, at the very least, our sons and daughters will. I can promise you that. I sincerely hope you're all well, and thank you for listening.